The setting sun cast a warm glow over Lawrence Smith's farm, stretching golden light across the fields of corn and wheat he had planted himself. The farm was his pride, the culmination of years of planning, hard work, and a deep desire for peace after serving 20 years in the Marines. After earning the nation's highest military honor, Lawrence traded the chaos of war for the quiet rhythm of the land. But lately, that peace had begun to fracture. Lawrence leaned against the barn, his sharp eyes scanning the horizon as unease prickled at him. The incident started small, a gate left open, leading to his livestock wandering loose. Then came the flat tires on his tractor, the irrigation system mysteriously tampered with, and just last week, his shed window smashed. He wanted to believe it was coincidence or random mischief, but deep down he knew better. This was deliberate. His property stood out in the county, not because it was the largest, it wasn't, but because he was one of the few black farmers in the area, and his success hadn't gone unnoticed. He'd overheard enough murmurs in town to know some people didn't like seeing him thrive here. The thought made his jaw tighten. He'd fought harder battles than this, and wasn't about to be intimidated now. As he turned toward the house, the low rumble of an approaching truck broke the stillness of the evening. Lawrence's hand instinctively drifted to his pocket, where his folding knife sat. A beat-up pickup rolled to a stop at the edge of his property, its driver lingering, the truck idling noisily as its headlights cut across the gravel driveway. A voice, sharp and mocking, called out, "Smith, you don't belong here. Time to pack it up before someone does it for you." Something small flew from the truck window and landed in the dirt before the vehicle sped off in a cloud of dust. Lawrence approached the crumpled note, unfolding it with steady hands. The message was scrawled in rough handwriting. "Sell your farm," or else, beneath the words, was a crude drawing of a burning barn. Lawrence's lips pressed into a hard line. These cowards thought they could rattle him, but they didn't know who they were dealing with. Turning back to the house, he resolved to prepare for whatever was coming next. At the kitchen table, Lawrence sat with the crumpled note in front of him, the faint smell of freshly brewed coffee filling the room. The warmth of the mug in his hands did little to ease the tightness in his chest. Emily, his wife, leaned against the counter, her arms folded as she stared at the paper. "They're not even hiding it anymore," she said, her voice low but sharp. "What kind of people threaten a man just for owning land?" Lawrence sighed, setting his mug down. "The kind who think they can scare me off," he replied. "But they've got another thing coming." Emily's lips pressed into a thin line, but her eyes betrayed her concern. She knew Lawrence well enough to see the determination hardening in his expression. "I just don't want this getting out of hand," she said softly. "We've got enough to worry about without you playing hero." "This isn't about being a hero," Lawrence said, his voice steady. "This is about standing my ground. They think they can intimidate us because of who we are, but I won't give them that satisfaction." The sound of gravel crunching outside made them both pause. Lawrence stood, his chair scraping against the floor as he moved to the window. A sheriff's cruiser had pulled into the driveway, its lights off. A wiry man in his mid-40s stepped out, adjusting his wide-brimmed hat before heading toward the door. Lawrence opened it before the man could knock. "Sheriff Grant," Lawrence greeted, his tone neutral. "What brings you out here?" Grant's gaze flicked to the crumpled note on the table behind Lawrence. "Heard about some trouble," he said. "Thought I'd check in?" "Trouble's one word for it," Lawrence replied, stepping aside to let him in. "Had a visitor last night. Left that behind." Grant picked up the note, his brow furrowing as he read it. He let out a low whistle. This is serious," he said, though his tone lacked conviction. "Any idea who might have sent it?" "No names, but I've got my suspicions," Lawrence said. "You know the kind of folks who don't take kindly to someone like me running a successful farm." Grant shifted uncomfortably, avoiding Lawrence's gaze. "Well, I'll file a report, but without any solid evidence, there's not much I can do," he said. "These things have a way of blowing over." "Blowing over?" Lawrence repeated, his jaw tightening. You think this is just going to go away on its own? I'm saying you might want to keep your head down, Grant said, his tone cautious. Don't go stirring up trouble. Lawrence stepped closer, his voice dropping to a cold, controlled tone. I didn't fight for this country just to come home and be told to keep my head down. I've dealt with worse than cowards who hide behind threats. Grant raised his hands in a placating gesture. I get it, Smith, I do. But this town's complicated. People don't like change, and you've got folks riled up just by being here. Riled up? Emily interjected, her voice cutting through the room. Owning land and working it isn't riling people up. It's existing. And if that's enough to make them mad, then that's their problem. Grant opened his mouth to respond, but seemed to think better of it. Instead, he placed the note back on the table. I'll see what I can do, he said finally, though his tone lacked conviction. Just be careful. Lawrence watched as the sheriff left, the tension in the room thick enough to cut with a knife. He turned to Emily, who shook her head. He's not going to help us, she said. Not really. No, Lawrence agreed. But that doesn't mean we're on our own. The next morning, the sun rose slowly over Lawrence Smith's farm, its golden rays stretching across the fields like a quiet reassurance. But the unease from the night before lingered, heavy and oppressive. Lawrence walked the perimeter of his property, his boots crunching against the dirt as he surveyed the damage from the past few weeks. The broken irrigation lines, the flattened crops, it all added up to one message. Whoever was behind this wasn't going to stop until they pushed him off his land. By the time Lawrence reached the edge of his property, he noticed fresh tire tracks cutting through the soft dirt. They weren't his. He knelt, running his fingers over the grooves, his sharp mind piecing together what it meant. Someone had been here, watching, waiting. Lawrence. Emily's voice carried across the field, sharp with urgency. He stood, his gaze snapping toward the house. She waved him over, holding a small package in her hands. His stomach sank as he approached. It was on the porch, she said, handing it to him. The box was plain and unmarked, sealed with thick tape. Lawrence's hands tensed as he opened it, revealing a single charred piece of wood, part of a fence post with a burnt word scrawled across it. Leave. Lawrence's eyes narrowed as he stared at the message. They're trying to break me, he said, his voice low. But they're about to find out just how wrong they are. He turned back toward the house, his mind already racing with plans. It was time to prepare for the next move because he knew they'd be back. The day passed in a haze of preparation. Lawrence spent hours reinforcing the fences, repairing weak spots, and checking the locks on every door and window. Emily followed behind him, her worry etched into every line of her face. You can't do this alone, she said softly as they worked side by side. I'm not alone, Lawrence replied, his voice firm. We've got each other and that's enough. But he knew it wasn't. As much as he hated to admit it, they needed help. And there was only one place he could turn. That evening, Lawrence drove into town. The streets were quiet, the usual hum of activity subdued. As he parked near the hardware store, he noticed the way people looked at him, some curious, others wary. He ignored them, his focus on gathering what he needed. Inside, Lawrence loaded his cart with nails, wood planks, and other supplies. As he reached for a roll of barbed wire, the clerk behind the counter cleared his throat. Building something, the man asked, his tone laced with skepticism. Just some repairs, Lawrence replied without looking up. The clerk raised an eyebrow. Heard you've been having some trouble out there. Lawrence paused, meeting the man's gaze. Word travels fast. The clerk shrugged. Small town. People talk. You sure it's a good idea staying out there? Some folks don't like change. Lawrence's lips pressed into a thin line. I'm not looking for trouble, but I'm not running from it either. The clerk nodded slowly, though his expression remained doubtful. Well, good luck to you. Back at the farm, Lawrence worked late into the night, stringing barbed wire along the fence line and reinforcing the barn doors with heavy wooden beams. Sweat poured down his face as he hammered nails into place, the physical labor grounding him, giving him a sense of control in the face of so much uncertainty. When he finally stepped back to survey his work, the farm wasn't a fortress, but it was ready. And so was he. That evening, as the stars began to dip the sky, Lawrence sat on the porch with Emily. The kids were already asleep inside, their laughter from earlier now replaced by the quiet hum of crickets. Emily leaned against him, her voice soft. "Do you really think we can stop them?" Lawrence's gaze drifted to the horizon, where the fields stretched endlessly into the dark. "We don't have a choice," he said. "This is our home, and I'll do whatever it takes to protect it." The next morning, Lawrence woke early, the faint light of dawn just beginning to peek through the windows. As he sipped his coffee, his phone buzzed on the kitchen table. He frowned, picking it up. "Lawrence, it's Michael Jackson," the voice on the other end said, panicked. "They're here. The gang. They're tearing my place apart." Lawrence gripped the phone tightly. "What are they doing?" "Everything," Michael replied, his words coming in bursts. "They've got bats, chains, they're smashing windows, breaking the fence. My wife's crying, and I can't stop them. I don't know what to do." Lawrence felt a surge of anger rising in his chest. "Lock the doors. Keep your wife safe." "I'm on my way." He hung up, his movements swift and precise as he grabbed his toolbox and threw it into the back of his truck. His mind raced as he climbed into the driver's seat, adrenaline coursing through him as the engine roared to life. Gripping the wheel tightly, he sped down the narrow country roads, each turn a countdown to what awaited him at Michael's property. When Lawrence arrived, his stomach churned at the sight of chaos. The gang was everywhere, their trucks parked haphazardly in the yard, engines idling like sentinels. 4 men moved across the property with deliberate malice, their leather jackets glinting in the sunlight. One swung a bat at a wooden fence, splinters flying with each strike, while another hurled a planter across the porch, shattering it against the wall. Broken glass and debris littered the ground. The leader, his red bandana loose around his neck, stood with his arms crossed near the front door, barking orders like a general commanding his troops. "Tear it down. Let him know we don't want him here." Lawrence parked just outside the gate, stepping out of his truck with slow, deliberate movements. His gaze swept the scene, taking in the destruction. His hand drifted to his toolbox, pulling out a crowbar. He wasn't just angry, he was ready to fight. The sound of his boots crunching against the gravel drew the gang's attention. The leader turned, his smug grin spreading as he motioned for his men to stop. "Well, look who showed up. Smith, you're just in time to see what happens when people don't take us seriously." Lawrence didn't respond immediately. He stepped forward, his gaze locked on the leader. "You've made your point. Now get the hell off this property." The leader chuckled, his men laughing along with him. "Point? Oh, we're just getting started. You see, Smith, this isn't just about one family. This is about all of you thinking you can stick around where you're not wanted." One of the men, a burly figure with a chain wrapped around his fist, sneered. "You think showing up here changes anything? You're outnumbered, Smith. Walk away while you still can." Lawrence's grip tightened on the crowbar, his voice sharp. "Outnumbered or not, you've got 2 choices. Leave now, or I'll make you leave." The leader's smirk twisted into a sneer as he stepped closer. "You think you can take us all on? You've got guts, I'll give you that. But guts won't protect your friends or your family." Lawrence's stomach tightened as the words hung in the air. His mind raced, calculating his next move. This wasn't just a fight for Michael's property. It was a fight for all of them. The air around Michael Jackson's property felt thick with tension as the standoff continued. Lawrence Smith stood firm, his crowbar gripped tightly in his hand. The gang leader's sneer deepened, his smug confidence radiating as his men spread out behind him. "You really think this ends with you standing there looking tough?" the leader mocked. "You don't get it, do you? This isn't just about this land. It's about sending a message. Lawrence's gaze didn't waver. The only message you're sending is that you're cowards who can't handle someone doing better than you. The gang leader laughed, his voice harsh. Cowards? Big talk for a man standing alone. From behind him, Emily's voice suddenly rang out. He's not alone. Lawrence turned slightly, just in time to see several trucks pulling into the property. Families from the community began stepping out armed with shovels, hammers, and even pitchforks. Henry Carter, a burly farmer, stepped to the front of the group, his expression grim. We heard what's been happening, Lawrence. Figured it was time to do something about it. The leader's smirk faltered for the first time as he took in the sight of the growing crowd. His men glanced at each other uneasily, their earlier bravado fading. You're making a mistake, the leader growled. All of you. Henry stepped forward, shovel in hand. The only mistake we've made is waiting this long to stand up to you. The leader's jaw tightened, but he quickly recovered, his grin returning. You think a bunch of farmers and their tools are going to stop us? You don't know who you're dealing with. Lawrence stepped forward, his voice cold and steady. And you don't know who you're dealing with. Leave now, or we'll make you. The gang leader's eyes flicked between Lawrence and the crowd behind him, weighing his options. Finally, he raised his hand, signaling his men to retreat. This isn't over, he said, his voice dripping with menace. We'll be back. As the gang climbed back into their trucks and roared off, the tension in the air remained. Lawrence turned to the group of families gathered behind him. Thank you, he said, his voice steady. But this isn't the end. They'll be back, and we need to be ready. The next few days were a blur of preparation. Lawrence's farm became the hub of the community's efforts. Men, women, and even teenagers worked tirelessly to fortify their homes and protect their land. Trenches were dug, fences reinforced, and makeshift barricades constructed. Henry stood beside Lawrence as they surveyed the work. We've done all we can, Henry said, wiping sweat from his brow. Now, we just have to hope it's enough. Lawrence nodded, his gaze fixed on the horizon. It will be, he said, though the weight of his words hung heavily in the air. The gang didn't wait long to make their next move. Early one morning, the sound of engines shattered the quiet stillness of the farm. Trucks rolled up to the edge of the property, their headlights cutting through the dawn mist. The leader climbed out, his red bandana tied tightly around his neck. Smith, he shouted, his voice echoing across the fields. We're not playing games anymore. Lawrence stepped out of the barn, his crowbar in hand. Behind him, Henry and several others emerged, their tools raised like weapons. You've already lost, Lawrence called back, his voice calm but firm. Go home. The leader's smirk returned. You really think you won? Let's see how you handle this. With a sharp whistle, the gang surged forward. The fight began with a chaotic clash of shouts, swinging tools, and flying debris. Lawrence ducked as a chain swung toward his head, his instincts kicking in as he countered with a sharp jab of his crowbar. The gang's numbers were overwhelming, but the community fought back with determination. From behind a stack of hay bales, a group of teenagers lobbed rocks and dirt clumps, striking gang members with surprising accuracy. Henry swung his shovel with precision, forcing two attackers to retreat. Emily and a few other women worked quickly to tend to the injured, their hands steady despite the chaos around them. Hold the line, Lawrence shouted, his voice cutting through the noise. Don't let them push through. The battle raged on, each side locked in a desperate struggle. The gang pressed their advantage, their confidence bolstered by their weapons and sheer numbers. But the community refused to back down, their unity proving to be their greatest strength. Near the barn, Lawrence faced off against one of the gang's largest members. The man swung a bat with wild intent, but Lawrence ducked, pivoting to land a solid strike with his crowbar. The attacker stumbled back, but another quickly took his place. Smith, the leader called out, his voice cutting through the din. You think this changes anything? We'll burn this place to the ground, if we have to. Lawrence didn't respond. He focused on the fight, his movements precise and unyielding. Each swing of his crowbar was a reminder of the battles he had fought before, the strength and discipline that had carried him through. As the fight continued, the tide began to shift. The gang's confidence faltered as they realized the community wasn't breaking as easily as they had expected. One by one, they began to retreat, their shouts of bravado replaced by curses and frustration. The leader glared at Lawrence, his eyes burning with hatred. "This isn't over," he spat. "We'll be back, and next time you won't see us coming." Lawrence's gaze didn't waver. "We'll be ready." As the gang retreated, the community gathered in the center of the farm, their faces weary but determined. Lawrence looked around at the group, his chest tight with both pride and exhaustion. "You did good today," he said, his voice carrying over the quiet murmurs. "But this isn't the end. They'll come back, and when they do, we'll show them we're not going anywhere." The group nodded, their resolve unwavering. Together, they began to clean up the aftermath of the fight, their unity stronger than ever. The farm was quiet again, but the air still felt heavy with tension. Lawrence Smith stood at the edge of his property, surveying the damage left behind by the gang. Broken fences, trampled crops, and scattered debris served as reminders of the battle that had taken place just hours earlier. The gang had retreated for now, but Lawrence knew they weren't done. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. Emily approached from the house, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. Her face was pale, her worry etched deeply into her features. "How long do you think we have before they come back?" she asked, her voice quiet but urgent. "Not long," Lawrence replied, his voice calm but firm. "They're regrouping. They'll want to come back stronger, and when they do, they'll bring everything they have." Emily's lips tightened. "And we'll be ready?" Lawrence nodded, his gaze steady. "We will. They think they can break us, but they don't know what we're capable of." That evening, Lawrence called a meeting. Families from the surrounding area gathered in the barn, their faces a mix of exhaustion and determination. The injuries from the earlier fight were fresh, bandaged arms, bruised faces, but their spirits hadn't broken. Lawrence stood at the front of the group, his presence commanding the room. "I know you're tired," he began, his voice carrying over the quiet murmurs. "I know you're scared. But we proved something today. They're not invincible. They thought they could walk onto our land, push us around, and force us to leave. But we stood our ground, and they left with their tails between their legs." The group nodded, murmurs of agreement rippling through the crowd. Henry Carter, standing near the back, stepped forward. "We're with you, Lawrence," he said, his voice strong. "But what happens next? They're not just going to give up." "They're not," Lawrence agreed. "That's why we need to prepare. This was just the beginning. The next time they come, it'll be bigger and more dangerous. We have to be ready for anything." A young man named David, barely in his 20s, spoke up from the side of the room. "What do we do if they bring more weapons? More men? We've only got tools and whatever we can find." Lawrence's gaze shifted to David, his expression steady. "We use what we have," he said. "This isn't about matching them weapon for weapon. It's about outsmarting them. They expect us to be scared, disorganized. We'll show them the opposite." The following days were a whirlwind of activity. Lawrence's farm became a fortress of sorts, with everyone working together to fortify the property. Trenches were deepened, fences were reinforced with barbed wire, and lookout points were established around the perimeter. Emily worked alongside the other women to organize supplies, setting up a central location for food, water, and first aid kits. Despite her fear, she refused to let it show. "If they think they can scare us, they've got another thing coming," she muttered as she stacked crates of bottled water. Lawrence spent his days strategizing, drawing maps of the property and marking key points for defense. Henry and a few others helped him construct barricades out of old lumber and metal scraps. It wasn't much, but it would slow the gang down if they tried to force their way through. The tension in the air grew heavier as the days passed. The families took shifts keeping watch, their eyes scanning the horizon for any sign of the gang's return. At night, the farm was eerily silent. The usual sounds of the countryside replaced by the hum of quiet conversations and the occasional crackle of a lantern. On the fourth night, the silence was broken. The faint rumble of engines carried through the cool night air, growing louder with each passing moment. Lawrence, sitting on the porch with his crowbar resting against his knee, stood abruptly. "They're here," he said, his voice calm but sharp. Emily appeared in the doorway, her face pale. "How many?" "Too many," Lawrence replied grimly. He turned to Henry, who had just stepped outside. "Wake everyone. It's time." Within minutes, the farm was alive with movement. Families gathered their weapons, shovels, hammers, and anything else they could find, and took their positions. Lawrence stood at the front of the group, his presence steadying those around him. The trucks came into view, their headlights cutting through the darkness like daggers. They screeched to a stop at the edge of the property, and the gang began to pour out. There were more of them this time, at least 20 men, all armed with bats, chains, and even a few crowbars. The leader climbed out last, his red bandana tied tightly around his neck. His grin was wide, his confidence unshaken. "Well, Smith," he called out, his voice carrying over the field. "Ready to give up yet?" Lawrence stepped forward, his crowbar resting against his shoulder. "Not a chance." The leader's grin widened. "Then you're dumber than I thought." He raised his hand, and the gang surged forward. The clash was immediate and chaotic. The gang charged the barricades, swinging their weapons wildly. The community fought back with everything they had. Lawrence moved like a man possessed, his crowbar a blur as he deflected blows and struck back with precision. Henry held his ground at one of the barricades, using his shovel to block and counter every attack. Behind him, a group of teenagers threw rocks and dirt clumps, their makeshift projectiles finding their marks more often than not. Emily worked frantically in the makeshift command center, tending to the injured and shouting instructions to those nearby. "Keep them away from the house," she yelled, her voice rising above the din of the fight. Despite their determination, the gang began to push through the defenses. The barricades creaked under the pressure, and the trenches filled with dust and debris. Lawrence shouted over the chaos, rallying the defenders. "Hold the line. Don't let them through." The leader of the gang advanced toward Lawrence, his bat resting on his shoulder. "You can't win this, Smith," he sneered. "You're outnumbered, outgunned, and out of time." Lawrence didn't flinch. "We're still standing, aren't we?" The leader swung his bat, but Lawrence ducked, countering with a sharp jab of his crowbar. The metal connected with the leader's ribs, and he stumbled back cursing. As the fight raged on, the tide began to shift. The gang, once so confident, started to falter. The community's unity and determination proved to be their greatest weapons. One by one, the gang members retreated, their earlier bravado replaced by frustration and fear. By the time the sun began to rise, the farm was quiet once more. The gang had fled, their threats echoing in the distance. Lawrence stood in the center of the yard, his chest heaving, his crowbar still in hand. Around him, the community began to regroup, their exhaustion giving way to relief. Emily approached him, her hands trembling as she placed them on his shoulders. "We did it," she said softly. Lawrence nodded, his gaze distant. The first rays of the morning sun spilled across Lawrence Smith's farm, casting long shadows over the battlefield it had become. The quiet that followed the gang's retreat was almost deafening, broken only by the occasional murmur of voices as the community gathered to assess the damage. Fences were broken, crops flattened, and the air still carried the acrid smell of burnt wood from makeshift barricades. Despite the exhaustion, there was an undeniable sense of victory among the defenders. Lawrence stood in the center of it all, his crowbar resting against his leg as he watched the families regroup. Emily approached him, her face pale but steady. "We pushed them back," she said softly. "But for how long?" Lawrence turned to her, his expression calm but resolute. Long enough to show them we're not afraid. That's what matters. The next few days were spent repairing the damage. The community worked together, rebuilding fences, replanting crops, and cleaning up the remnants of the battle. Despite the physical toll, spirits were high. People shared stories, laughed over small victories, and reminded each other of the strength they had shown. Henry Carter, who had become one of Lawrence's closest allies, stood beside him as they hammered new boards into place on the barn. "You know," Henry said, pausing to wipe sweat from his brow, "I don't think they'll be back anytime soon. We gave them a fight they weren't expecting." Lawrence nodded, but his expression remained guarded. "Maybe," he said, "but we can't let our guard down. They might try something else, something worse." Henry sighed. "Then we'll be ready. You showed us how to stand up for ourselves, Lawrence. That's something they can't take away." One evening, as the repairs were nearing completion, Lawrence received an unexpected visitor. A sleek, black sedan pulled into the driveway, its polished surface gleaming in the fading sunlight. The driver's door opened, and out stepped Sheriff Grant, his hat in hand. Lawrence met him at the porch, his arms crossed. "What brings you out here, Sheriff?" Grant shifted uncomfortably, his gaze flicking toward the repaired fences and barricades. "Heard about what happened," he said. "Figured I'd check in." "We handled it," Lawrence replied evenly. "No thanks to you?" Grant winced at the sharpness in Lawrence's tone. "I know I didn't do enough," he admitted. "But things are changing in this town. People are starting to see that what happened here, what you did, it matters. You stood up when no one else would." Lawrence's eyes narrowed. "And where were you when we needed you?" Grant sighed, his shoulders sagging. "I made a mistake, but I'm here now, and I want to make it right." For a long moment, Lawrence said nothing. Finally, he nodded. "If you want to help, make sure this never happens again. Hold them accountable." Grant nodded in return. "You have my word." The weeks turned into months, and life on the farm slowly returned to normal. The fields were replanted, the fences rebuilt, and the scars of the battle faded with time. The gang never returned, their threats empty in the face of a united community. Word spread about what had happened, and Lawrence's story became a symbol of resilience and courage. One afternoon, as Lawrence stood at the edge of his property, watching the wind ripple through the golden fields, Emily joined him. She slipped her hand into his, her grip warm and steady. "Do you think it's over?" she asked. Lawrence tilted his head, considering her question. "It's never really over," he said. "But we've shown them that this land is ours, that we won't back down." Emily smiled faintly. "You're a stubborn man, Lawrence Smith." He chuckled softly, squeezing her hand. "It's what kept me alive, and it's what will keep us here." As the sun dipped below the horizon, the farm stood as a testament to everything Lawrence and his community had fought for. It wasn't just a patch of land. It was a symbol of their determination, their unity, and their refusal to be silenced. The battles they had faced had left their mark, but they had also forged something stronger, a community that wouldn't be broken. And as the stars began to fill the night sky, Lawrence Smith knew one thing for certain. No matter what came next, they were ready.